Stan, I just want to again publicly thank you for doing this. We've known each other for quite a long time, and long before I met you, I admired you for your contributions to education in particular, but also for the use of technology in government. Stan, as you probably read his bio in his paper, has a long history with IBM, with New York State and New York City government, and particularly in education, both elementary, secondary, and higher education, and also how technology can play a role. So talk about a person whose background and experience and knowledge is so right, spot on to everything we've been trying to do with this series. So Professor, thank you so much for doing this, and I won't take any more of your valuable time. I'll turn it over to you and let you educate us all.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm delighted to join this morning, and I'll take a little time to talk about COVID-19 and what it has meant in terms of disruption of the U.S. economy, education in particular, and then just connect it a little bit to some longer term issues and policy issues that I think that those at SEPA and other institutions spend a lot of time on. And I know that I sent around a little bit of a condensation of some of the writing that I've been doing for Barron's. I'm doing a regular column for Barron's, opinion column, and trying to really connect the pandemic to a whole host of issues. So as Bill said, I've spent a lot of time in my career on education, both in government when I worked in the mayor's office, as deputy schools chancellor back in the early 1990s, as an education advocate during the city fiscal crisis, and during my tenure at IBM as president of the foundation, initiating a number of education reform efforts through the private sector, where we also managed and led 3 national education summits for the presidents of the United States back in 96, 99, and 2001. So I think my view about education is that it's critical. It's connected to virtually every policy issue that we're concerned with. It's connected to income inequality. It's connected to economic opportunity. It's connected to health. It's connected to virtually every issue. And I think in a lot of ways, we've seen some improvements in education, but as the bar continues to get raised and expectations continue to rise, education has not moved as quickly as we would like. So things have changed. So a high school diploma that used to be the #1 metric for achieving success is no longer the case, because when we look at the high wage jobs that are being created, about 90% of them or more require a post-secondary degree. When we look at the economics of a high school diploma, it doesn't equate to a middle-class lifestyle any longer, and many of those jobs are declining. So the bar, as I said, has been raised, and people have to achieve at higher levels. So in terms of looking at education and the education reform agenda, from my standpoint, there's a big agenda in terms of improving teacher quality, thinking more carefully about how to connect school to college to career, and figure out how we can develop and achieve against a higher set of metrics. And right smack in the middle of that comes the pandemic. And what happens? Without any notice, schools get canceled for about 50 million students across the United States in early to mid-March. And for all intents and purposes, they stay closed for half a year. And when we look at what the impact is significant and severe, because the assumption about remote learning as a substitute for in-class instruction really doesn't hold up. Because we know that not every student has a device, and while some school districts have tried to get them, not all students have access to a device. Connectivity is not equal across the United States. In certain cities like Pittsburgh, for example, 25% of the population lacks connectivity. In rural areas, it's much larger. And having access to a device and having connectivity doesn't equate to learning outcomes, because the quality of what you've got, the support structures that are in place, are not in place equally across geography, and they're not equal across age level or income level or achievement levels. So we know that students robbed of an in-class instructional opportunity, some of them had some access to remote learning, but the quality is uneven, the access is uneven, and the results, I think, are going to be pretty poor. So as we move towards school opening, it's become incredibly controversial about how do you open schools safely, and how do you make sure that students get some classroom instruction and some better, higher quality remote instruction for the days that they're not in school. I had the advantage or disadvantage, I'll leave it to you to determine, to serve on Mayor de Blasio's task force on school reopening. And we participated in about, I would say, 6 or 7 meetings. We actually had an agenda by the 3rd meeting. We were divided into task forces by the 4th meeting. And then 2 weeks later, we completed our work, and you saw what they came up with in terms of a final result. I will say that what I advocated for, and I thought made a lot more sense in terms of school reopening to give more stability for young people, was to ensure all the health and safety issues through testing, tracing, quarantine, masks, wipe downs, all you name it, but dividing the school day into a morning session and an afternoon session, which is basically what New York City had back in the 1950s when the school population exploded, and to avert having classes that had 40 students in a class, New York City and many other school districts around the country had a split session where half of the students attended in the morning and half attended in the afternoon. The advantage of a pandemic and that kind of a solution would be that every school could be open and every student could be attending 5 days a week. Some school districts have embraced the suggestion that I made. Boulder, Colorado is one where they are open now, and they are doing split session, and every student will go to school 5 days a week. New York City chose to develop a solution where half of the students would attend 2 or 3 days a week or 1 day a week, and the other half would attend the other days. And the disadvantage of having 10 days of instruction a month as opposed to regular instruction, I think, is something that will hurt educationally. But I know that people are very concerned about the health and safety issues. And in New York City, somewhere between 25 and 30% of students will not attend at all. They will just attend remotely. So we have a challenge in terms of remote learning. We have a challenge of getting people back to school, and we have a challenge about the financial impact of all that has taken place. And that's why there was, while a lot of disagreement in the stimulus package that broke down, there was agreement that there needed to be federal money that would help school districts around the United States to be able to cope with operating schools under these severe requirements. One thing I do think we have to acknowledge, and I wrote about this in my next op-ed for Barron's, is that while we had a serious lack of leadership on a federal level in both health and economic policy, I don't think we have a full appreciation of how the federal government dropped the ball on education policy issues. The issue of remote learning could have been addressed in a more can you hear me now?
Yes.
Had U.S. education policy really address this issue of remote learning in the context of any kind of pandemic planning. Because if you were going to have a pandemic, in addition to understanding that people would put pressures on a healthcare system, people should have understood the impact on education. And connectivity and access to remote learning should have been something on a policy level that the federal government should have agreed to, understood, embedded in a pandemic plan. And then when things hit in January, not March, not April, not June, not July, not August, there should have been a plan in place to give more students access to the technology that they needed. So if there was a pandemic, devices should have been made available. If there was a pandemic, there should have been connectivity guaranteed, just like other kinds of things have been done in an emergency to give people access to something that they don't have. And here, the US Department of Education, I think, was absent. Not absent for a day, they were absent for half a year, and not speaking out publicly and not making it clear to the Congress in the earliest efforts to cope with the pandemic that this should have been addressed. And in terms of remote learning, there is an enormous amount of inequality that is being provided. There could have been an opportunity for college students across the United States to have helped students in K-12 schools to be able to access remote learning. They had the technical expertise. They could have provided assistance to teachers for a modest amount of spend in internships, paid internships. We could have built a support structure for students all across the country. And I would hope when there is a new administration coming January, that for the next pandemic, there really will be an effective plan that will deal with the access to higher quality and more effective remote learning. The second part of the education challenge is higher ed. And institutions that I'm teaching at, like Columbia and Duke, I think people did as well as could be expected as they moved from in-class to remote learning. But in public higher education systems, especially among community colleges, we had some of the same problems that we have in K-12 because students didn't have a device, didn't have connectivity, and they weren't continuing their learning. And that is showing up now as we see the enrollment decline numbers in public higher education institutions. I'm a trustee of the State University of New York. We have 64 campuses. We have 30 community colleges. Some of them in rural areas, the students are not learning at all. They did not complete their classes. They definitely had significant problems from a standpoint of mental health. They had other kinds of issues, and it has resulted in significant enrollment decline. And what we're going to see is that many, many public higher education institutions are going to close down. There have been estimates that as many as 400 to 500 colleges will not be able to open their doors. They will not be able to open, period. Again, they will be shut for long term. They will not survive the pandemic. And what does that mean? That means that we're going to be looking forward to an increase in income inequality because we need to get more students a post-secondary degree. And that's where I think we really need a different kind of PPP. In the stimulus, PPP was payroll protection program. But I think we need to go back to what we used to think PPP was, which is public-private partnership. I think the private sector needs to step up to the plate. It's in their interest to do so and cover the tuition of their employees, cover the tuition cost of people who could be their employees, and find a way to cost share to make tuition not the major barrier that it is. And that's something that could stem the enrollment decline issue and could significantly improve education and skills for people who are in the workforce and are at risk of losing their jobs, because they don't have the education and skills to continue to be employed. And that's where I think the public-private partnership could play a big role in addressing the enrollment crisis that we're having in public higher education. From the standpoint of students, I think we're finding far too many students who have lost the opportunity for paid internships or cooperative education programs because of the pandemic. And I think that's where the private sector, again, needs to step up to the plate. I was glad that my former employee, IBM, agreed to commit to 1,000 paid internships for the programs that they're involved with and others over the next year, both in person and remote, because it's in their interest and other private sector business interests. And I would love to see other private sector companies following that model. I was very pleased to see that JP Morgan and a number of other New York companies have agreed to spend a fair amount of time recruiting 100,000 low-income New Yorkers for jobs in New York. And that will also require a commitment to education and training, because not everyone who is low income and not everyone who needs a job has the skills to be successful at companies like JP Morgan. And that's where I think it is in the private sector interest to step up the plate and really do something important. And when people say, well, why would the private sector do that? I think we have examples in US history where the private sector has really stepped up to the plate. They began the concept of paid vacations. They began the concept of pensions. All of this was done before the end of the 19th century. The first pension plan, American Express, did it in 1875. The first free healthcare program for employees was done by Macy's in 1870. So it's not that companies can't step up to the plate and address a serious problem that is at the nexus between their economic interests and societal interests. But here, the pandemic will provide a clear opportunity for people to address the challenge and problem, especially in higher ed. I also think that we are not really giving a full appreciation to the impact on non-governmental organizations as a result of the pandemic, especially for those who provide human services and those who are dealing with people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. We're seeing big increases in mental health issues. Who serves that issue? It's not the government. It may be government money done through contracts, but it's not for profit human services agencies who provide those kinds of services. Settlement houses, community centers across New York and cities all across the country. And they're dependent upon their government contracts. And the reduction in government revenue has hurt their revenue on a contract basis. At the same time, the demand for those services has increased. One clear example is cases of child abuse and cases of abuse of parents. Those cases are increasing. I talked to Safe Horizon, run by a young woman who used to work for me when I was Deputy Chancellor of Schools, Ariel Zwang, and they're seeing a huge increase in cases of abuse and neglect. And they are the entity that responds to that. They're a not-for-profit organization, and they need the government money through their contract, and it's being severely threatened. And it's not just those specific kinds of agencies. I spoke to the chief executive officer of the American Cancer Society. They've laid off 1,000 people. 25% of the American Cancer Society staff got laid off as a consequence of the pandemic. They're one of the largest investors in cancer research. And with a huge cut in their revenue as a result of contributions and things like that, they're going to be doing less cancer research. Do we think that this is a time we want less research on cancer, less services to people who have cancer? The needs are increasing, and those not-for-profit organizations are under serious threat. And I think it is a good opportunity for the private sector to step up and increase its contribution levels, increase its match for employee contributions, increase the incentives for their employees to do pro bono community service, not just, a day of service, cleaning up a park, but using their best talent and expertise to make an impact on the not-for-profit sector. I think if we could think about it, that not-for-profit sector controls a fair amount of the US economy. They represent 5% of GDP, 5%, a significant number of jobs. 1 out of every 10 jobs in the United States is done at a not-for-profit organization. And this pandemic is affecting their very survival. And that's an opportunity for the federal government and state governments to step up to the plate and recognize it's not just government workers who are being threatened by the pandemic, it's the people who work for not-for-profit. Also, I think we have an opportunity, again, because employment opportunities are being threatened, especially for recent college graduates, to increase our spending on national and community service. There's a bill in Washington sponsored by Republican and Democrat legislators to give more community service opportunities through AmeriCorps and national service kinds of opportunities to more young people. And I think we could raise the wage, we could provide more opportunity for 1-year paid internships through that kind of a program to give more young people who are not seeing the opportunities in the private sector for jobs to really have at least a year or more to be able to work and do community service in an effective kind of way. Then I think, again, we've seen a real hit on small businesses across the United States, especially women and minority-owned businesses in cities like New York. And when people have thought about what to do about it, they focused mainly on a government assistance over the short term. But they're not going to have a short-term problem. They're going to have a long-term problem. And here's where the private sector really can play a role. Small business, US-wide, accounts for about 1% of the supply chain spending of large companies. I think we could ask private companies to step up to the plate and agree to meet a 5% or 10% rate for the amount of their small business spending in their own supply chain. If you were a small business and you became a supplier to a company like JP Morgan or IBM or Accenture or any other Fortune 500 company, the research done by a think tank in New York, Center for an Urban Future, demonstrates that within 2 years, they would double their workforce and double their revenue. So it's not just government money that could help small business. It's getting them into the supply chains of large companies. And that would make an enormous amount of difference, especially for women and minority-owned businesses. And finally, I think that there really is an opportunity for the government to look at the pandemic as an opportunity to ramp up spending, not on just the emergency issues that we've talked about, but to ramp up spending on scientific research. I think we have seen under the current administration, we have seen a disastrous cut in federal investment in science and in research. And that really needs to end. There's a bill that was introduced by Senator Chuck Schumer of New York with Republican co-sponsors to be able to significantly increase research spending through universities and others, especially on the emerging and emergent issues that people are facing. And I think that's, again, a response to the pandemic that will really pay dividends over the long term. It'll make an impact on things like healthcare issues and environmental issues, but an investment in research also it pays dollars and has a return on the economic value and the job creation value of research. So as I'm talking about the pandemic, I would just review, number one, K to 12, huge problem, needs to be met with federal resources and private sector partnership in K to 12. Higher ed, it's an enrollment crisis that we're facing US-wide, and it could have real costs over multiple number of years. Again, we need government money, but we also need private sector, public-private partnership. We need them to step up to the plate and play a much larger role in addressing the crisis in skills and education. In terms of the not-for-profit sector, again, an opportunity for government to guarantee contracts for the social safety net, for those extensive programs that are being run with government money, but being managed and led by not-for-profit organizations. We really need a national policy on K to 12 and higher ed, but we also need a national effort to stem the crisis that's being caused on not-for-profit organizations, both those that are frontline workers, like the examples I talked about, and the larger scale not-for-profits, like an American Cancer Society. Small business, again, we need government support, but we also need the private sector to step up and make sure that their supply chain spending is equally spent on small and mid-sized businesses, especially women and minority-owned business, and a real investment in research. I think that as we look back on what has happened US-wide as a consequence of COVID-19 and the pandemic, we can say the federal government definitely was a failure. They didn't have a policy. They didn't enact the policy. This was not something that was state by state response. It needed a federal response, and it didn't need to wait for 3, 4, or 5 waves of stimulus spending. There needed to be an upfront strategy around testing, tracing, treatment, and also the financial support that local and state governments needed. And that federal policy shouldn't have been restricted to healthcare and the economics. It should have included education and the social safety net. And then in terms of going forward, we need to understand that this pandemic, as horrible as it isn't going to be the only pandemic that we're going to face. So we need to address these issues on a national level. And one would hope that in the future, the Congress, whoever is the president, as they're thinking about these issues long term, will not be playing catch up for the American public, but will be really doing these things in a concerted and effective way with the appropriate kind of planning and implementation, done in an effective way that is going to benefit all Americans. So I see we've got a couple of questions, and then I would encourage others to ask other questions. So I've got one from Bill Emick. What about giving technology companies advantage for government contracts if they provide tablets with connectivity for all public school students who receive meals? That is, students from families with lower incomes. And what about negative income tax that provides every family that works with a livable income? Private sector provides market rate pay, and income tax tops it off to bring it up to a living family income. This is where I think that when we think creatively about public-private partnership, some of it could be incentives from the government, but some of it has to be that the private sector steps up to the plate and plays a significant role on these issues. Some companies did donate tablets, but we needed to make sure that everyone had access to the right tablet, in a combination of government action and private sector action. On the connectivity issue, that is something that the government needed to step up to the plate on. In terms of small businesses, again, government, but also private sector. I think the private sector had a big role to play here, and it's not just from a societal interest, it's from their own self-interest, because they will be hurt if the economy doesn't move forward as quickly as they would like. And there is the opportunity for them to make the kinds of contributions. And we've talked about, you know, what is the advantage to the private sector? Well, you know, the advantage to the private sector is more and more young people are saying they don't want to work for a company that doesn't have a strong corporate social responsibility effort. We're seeing more investors like BlackRock making public statements and saying they're not going to invest in a company that doesn't have a strong corporate social responsibility platform. We see more and more people saying they don't want to buy from a company that doesn't have a strong corporate social responsibility effort. So I think this is something where the private sector can understand they have to step up to the plate and do so. And it doesn't only have to be done through government regulation. It can be done through recognition. You know, when New York City under the Bloomberg administration gave restaurants an A, B, or C in their window based upon their health and safety issues, how many people do you think want to go into a C restaurant that's got a C in the window? So how many people will want to go to work for a company that was a D company or a C company? So you could think about rating companies based upon what they do in real significant ways, and then giving them something that wouldn't have to cost taxpayers a nickel. Just give them the ability, if they really step up to the plate, to become an A company and do all the things that we've been talking about and more. So I think, you know, public-private partnership and giving companies the opportunity to really lead on these issues. You know, similar, somebody, you know, Vera Van Tamsen said, similar to the way schools are rated. Give people the opportunity to step up to the plate and improve their capability. And I think the private sector, you know, they can't stay back. They really have to step up to the plate and lead on these issues. So I haven't seen other kinds of questions, but I have a question. So when we think about the pandemic, you know, and what it has done to young people in the universities, to people in K-12, to people who are low income, we can see that it hasn't been equal. Just like when we look at the rates of infection, they're not the same for everyone. They are definitely more for people of color. They're definitely more for low-income people who don't have access to healthcare. So the inequality that we've seen in our society is being affected and magnified by the pandemic. So if anyone has a question of any other issue beyond the ones that we've already talked about that have been significantly affected by the pandemic, and people are looking for creative solutions, you know, what might they be? You know, one of the things that when I've looked at K-12, for example, you know, let's just assume that at some point we have higher quality treatment, we have a vaccine, our schools reopen. Let's just assume that is the future, whether it's a 2021 future or later in 2020 or 2022. At some point, we get back to having a K-12 system that is open 180 plus days a year. And we have young people who are going to schools. Will that solve the core problems that we've got in K-12? Well, I would argue no, because in New York City, when we look at the opportunity for young people, there are one set of opportunities for students who are upper income and white, and another for those who are low income and people of color. Far too many schools have restricted admissions criteria. And that's not just the Stuyvesants and Bronx Science. Hundreds and hundreds of schools across New York City and across the country have some type of admission criteria to get in. And that's something on a policy level that really needs to end. And when we look at the composition of the teaching force, what percentage of teachers in K-12 institutions are teachers of color? 20%. Less than 50% of the students in the United States in public schools are white, but 80% of the teachers are white. In public higher education institutions, 85% of faculty are white. And what do we know? We know that far too many students who don't see a teacher who looks like them don't do well academically. So maybe when we think about education policy coming out of a pandemic, we don't only have to address healthcare issues, but we could think about education as an issue that has serious, racial problems attached to it. Got another question here. What about having a virtual conference to educate corporate decision makers on these problems? K-12 lacking devices and the established 450 colleges that could be shut down completely and begin to match them or have them pledge to fund these efforts. I think that that's exactly what the private sector needs to do. If you look at the discussion in the three sectors of the economy, private, public, and not-for-profit, far too often they're all talking to each other. They don't have access cross-sector. So the people in the private sector are very isolated and very siloed from understanding what the impact on government and what the impact is on the not-for-profit sector. And the same is true of government and the not-for-profit sector. When decisions are being made at a government level that will impact on the not-for-profit sector, the not-for-profit sector isn't even at the table. They're not part of the decision-making process. So I think the idea of a large-scale virtual conference with leaders cross-sector to talk about how to engender this kind of cross-sector collaboration would be a great idea. I'm going to be starting a new executive education program at Duke on corporate social responsibility. And it's not for CSR professionals, it's for heads of HR, heads of government programs, heads of legal, people in the C-suite. They need to understand what societal performance by companies really means, and they need to step up to the plate and have a higher level of performance. And it's not going to happen unless they have access to the data and the information that people in academia have on these kinds of issues. Another question here from John Alexander Sinman. Is there a possibility that the federal government or any other, due to governance and legislative process, does not have the ability to act expediently on new problems? What can we do? Maybe have an elite team of project managers to deal with things quickly that report to government. Project managers, innovators, and public service leaders and drivers like us, people in EMPA kinds of programs. Absolutely. I'll give you an example of a program that I started at IBM. It's called the Corporate Service Corps. If you're an IBM employee and you're in the company 3 to 5 years, and you've got a strong technology background, you've been rated highly, you get to apply to get a 1-month paid group internship in the developing world to work on a serious, significant societal problem. 800 young, high-achieving employees a year participate in that program. They're sent out in teams of 8 to 12 on a 1-month assignment. For example, a team of Corporate Service Corps employees at IBM, we sent them to Cross River Province in Nigeria. They developed the technology infrastructure for the healthcare program for poor women and children. They developed something that wound up 18 months after the assignment for serving 95,000 poor women and children in Cross River Province in Nigeria. And for the people who had that assignment, it improved their skills, it increased the length of time that they expect to work for IBM, when that program is explained by IBM recruiters, that if you go to work for IBM, you can actually essentially participate in the Peace Corps while working for a company like IBM, it has been the third most important issue that people have chosen to work within the company. If you had the opportunity to participate in those kinds of things while you're, thinking about entering the workforce, and that could provide the real professional expertise in the public sector, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, I think we'd have higher skilled people employed, and we'd also have a higher capability to address all of these kinds of programs. So I think, yes, absolutely, that's a great idea. And I'd love to see more companies doing this. And I'd like to see them opening up that opportunity, not just for their own employees, but for people who are in MPA programs at Columbia and Harvard and SUNY and other higher education institutions. Yes, absolutely. Another one, what about universal basic income? How would we manage the possibility that many of those who would otherwise provide services as labor would no longer? Do we have a system that can provide what we need if we lost most of the workforce due to universal basic income? Well, I think universal basic income is one idea. I think that there are lots of other opportunities. I like especially the idea of providing higher level of education and skills for people and economic opportunity, and ultimately help them transition into the workforce. I think I mentioned that at IBM, I started a program called P-TECH. And the concept of P-TECH really was to create a smooth pathway from school to college to career. The first school opened in Crown Heights in Brooklyn in 2011. President Obama featured it in his State of the Union address in 2013 and visited the school. It's a total open enrollment school, but it's a combination of high school and community college. So students have the opportunity to take their high school courses and dual enrollment with their college courses, and in anywhere from 4 to 6 years, complete their high school diploma and a community college degree. IBM is the business partner in that first school and provides paid internships, mentors, structured workplace visits, and assistance and support for the school. And it has college completion rates that are now 500% higher than the national average. And every single graduate that IBM has hired is a person of color. Not one white student in the school, and not one white hire for the company. There are now over 200 of those P-TECH schools across the United States and around the world. The P-TECH school in Colorado has a population that's over 80% Latinx. The population in rural areas are less people of color, but they're very, very economically disadvantaged. The school up by the Canadian border, for example. And there are P-TECH schools in Australia, in Morocco, in Ireland, all following the same kind of model, demonstrating that you can have real opportunity if you're given the opportunity and given the support so that people can get beyond racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and economic discrimination. So that's an opportunity for more and more private sector companies, not just to wait to do their recruitment of young people when they come out of college, but actually help them make that pathway from school to college to career and change the diversity of their population. It's totally unacceptable for a technology company like Microsoft, where 2.6% of its executives are people of color. 2.6%. Do you know what it is at Google? 3.6%. Does that make sense? You know, we can't have an industry like the technology industry not represent the kind of economic issue that is facing our country. And they need to really step up to the plate. Okay, we've got a question from Professor Adela Gondak. Can we hear your question, Professor?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I have two questions, both sort of takeoffs from your paper. The first one, you mentioned the public service, and I'm just wondering, why is it that we in this country are so reticent to have mandatory public service? And if you look at the data on COVID and compare it with mandatory national service, you see in the EU, Germany and Denmark have mandatory national service, and so do South Korea and Japan. And those are the countries that have the lowest rates, because when the leader says, start wearing masks, they all start wearing masks. So I'm just wondering whether, there's a kind of a lawfulness that is sort of conveyed to the population if there is mandatory public service, and whether that would be a possibility. It wouldn't have to be military. It could be other forms like AmeriCares and so on. And my second question is on the emphasis on connectivity, because I'm just emerging this morning from 10 days after the hurricane without any connectivity in Connecticut. Some countries, in particular, I'm thinking of an EMPA student I had from Afghanistan, and he invented tablets which just had the entire school curriculum embedded. So parents didn't have to worry about children looking at anything else, and the child could do it on their own time and even choose the ethnicity and race of the excellent teacher that they were listening to, who would begin, "You are now in kindergarten." And another child might have had that 10 days later, because maybe they had to take care of the sheep. Now, he invented that for Afghanistan because of the fact that children cannot go to school any time practically, because they'll step on landmines. So, having this kind of tablet where you can just sit at home in the villages and just do school on your own is better than being detonated. But in any case, are those possibilities that would fit into your suggestions?
I'm going to answer both questions. First of all, I think it is encouraging that there is now bipartisan support on this national service bill that was introduced by the senator from Delaware. He has strong support among Democratic legislators. He actually also has now strong support from Republican legislators as well. So the people who are leading that effort, for example, a guy named John Bridgeland, who I know very well, who was domestic policy advisor to George Bush, is part of that national effort. Stanley McChrystal, a former general, is part of that effort. So people on both sides of the aisle. I am actually very optimistic that that national service bill, once we get past the election, I think I see national service as something that would have broad support. I think it's like Peace Corps, which has had broad support on both sides of the aisle ever since it was created. I ran a program called the Urban Corps in New York City back under John Lindsay. We had 10,000 college students a year working on paid internships in the city of New York in that period of time. So I think if with the right kind of leadership, bipartisan national service can be enacted and can provide great benefits, those who are participants, but also for the country. On the connectivity issue, I think absolutely. I think in the last stimulus bill, before it got passed, there was $2 billion for internet connectivity that was in the legislation and got taken out at the last minute. I think the lack of connectivity is something that people have begun to understand, and I'm so glad that it was in both the Republican and the Democratic version before it blew up this time. So I see them addressing that issue as well. There were two other questions. One on P-TECH. I think Jeremy asked, are they private and do they provide scholarships? The answer is they are 100% public. They are not charter schools. They are 100% open enrollment, and they are for all students, and the entire cost is provided 100% free. No student pays tuition for any college course. They complete the program, and some students complete 6-year, 4-year high school, 2-year community college in 3.5 years, 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. So it can be free. And for example, it has cost savings because not one student in any P-TECH school has ever taken a remedial course. You guys know what remedial education cost the United States last year? $3 billion. Not one nickel in P-TECH spent on remediation. So that's an opportunity providing the free tuition, and you get the benefit back in no remedial instruction. And then we had another question about leadership. It's a leadership crisis. I think John Alexander Sinman talking about, why didn't we have more leadership? I think that is a lesson that we have learned from the pandemic. We needed national leadership, and we didn't get it. And this is an opportunity as we think towards the election to be able to think about a leader for our nation that is really going to lead on these issues and really, make sure that people in Congress on both sides of the aisle are going to be speaking out about that need for leadership. And then Mia Teresa Jamil asked, has IBM Education ever considered teaching the P-TECH public high school graduates their company's internal design thinking practitioner curriculum and then involving the students in the design and development of these emerging ed tech solutions? And the answer is yes, and they are now incorporating design thinking in part of the P-TECH program. And if you go to ptech.org, you'll see there is an online curriculum around design thinking that is being provided not just to the students in P-TECH schools that are connected to IBM, but to any student all across the United States. There are now 600 companies that are partners with P-TECH programs across the United States. Some of them are technology companies, some of them are in advanced manufacturing, some of them are in healthcare, some of them in finance, and they all have access to those design thinking classes. I really think that there is a lot more that companies can really do to solve the skills crisis. This was very, very high on everyone's agenda before the pandemic hit. I think now it's even more important. When you're looking at the jobs that haven't been hurt by the pandemic, they're the jobs that require the higher skill levels. The jobs that have been hurt are the jobs that require only high school degrees. And we really have to put pressure. When we look at college completion, the percentage of young people of color who register at an institution like the City University of New York or the State University of New York or all public higher education institutions who complete is very, very low. So do we want a higher education system where 9 out of 10 of the students who register for a community college don't complete within 3 years? Obviously, college registration is not the ticket to a career. It's college degree. And that's where we have to think far more seriously than we have before on getting people through. We had one more question on splitting the school day. How might students be able to commute safely to and from school if their parents might have to go to work? I think that's something that has to be addressed by the City of New York through our public transit systems. We have to make them safe. I don't think split session is a solution unless our schools and our city is safe. If it's not safe, we can't have our kids going into school. But if it is safe, I think the double session option works more effectively than attending every other day or every other week. So I have now been encouraged to understand that our 1 hour session is approaching its completion. I would like to say that that teaching at Columbia is something that I've enjoyed a great deal. I enjoy teaching at Duke because it not only gives me the opportunity to teach, but it gives me the opportunity to connect with the next generation of leaders, people like those of you who have been on this video opportunity, because I really think that the future is yours. I've had my career. I've had a great opportunity to work for the mayor of New York, a governor of New York, to be deputy chancellor of schools, to work for a great company, to do a lot of great things. And now I'm writing and teaching. But the most important thing that people like myself can do is really provide assistance to the next generation. So if there are other questions that people had and you didn't have the opportunity to ask them during this 1 hour session, please feel free to email me. If there's other things that were on your mind, I'd be happy to answer them at any time. So I want to thank Jeremy. I want to thank all of those who gave me the opportunity to talk to you guys, Bill Emick, who I consider a great colleague and a great friend, and everyone else. And thank you very much.